In all these videos, we've looked at the Old Testament background and Old Testament theology, which informs our understanding of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, when you read through the Gospels, you'll notice that each particular evangelist uses the Old Testament in a different sort of way. The first three, the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they typically tend to use the Old Testament by means of quotations and allusions. Matthew has the most of these. He has 124. Mark has about 70 of these. And Luke has about 109. So there's a significant number of quotations and allusions in these first three of the Gospels. Now, when you get to the Gospel of John, he approaches things a little bit differently. He only has 27 quotations or allusions to the Old Testament. However, his gospel is pervaded by images and figures from the Old Testament. So he approaches things a little bit differently. Rather than having a direct quotation, he draws upon these Old Testament images in order to use those to demonstrate who Christ is and the significance of his work. And in today's video, we're going to look at a situation which is no different. John chapter 21, which is the account of Jesus' appearance to his disciples, his third manifestation to his disciples after his resurrection from the dead. And even though in this particular part of John, there are no Old Testament quotations or allusions, there are a significant number of images that are drawn from very climactic moments in the Old Testament, which I think are going to shed light on our understanding of what is happening when Jesus appears to his disciples on the seashore of Tiberias. So the story basically is this. This is the third time Jesus manifested himself to his disciples. There's 7 of them. They have gone fishing. They're on the sea. They haven't caught anything. Jesus stands on the shore, tells them to throw the net on the right side of the boat, which they do, and there's a miraculous catch of fish. In fact, they count them, 153 in all. Peter swims to shore ahead of everyone else. They drag the net to the shore, and Jesus sits with his disciples in the context of a meal, and he provides bread and meat for them in this manifestation of himself. So what's going on here? Well, I think there's a few questions that we need to ask ourselves. And the chief of these is this: why would Jesus choose to manifest himself as the day was breaking? That's the time of day. The day is breaking on the shore of a sea by means of a miracle and in the context of a meal with bread and with meat. Now, as we'll see, each of these particular components of the story are significant when we compare them to the Old Testament background. Before we do that, note that John chapter 21 and John chapter 6 are very similar in structure. John chapter 6 starts out with talk about an impending Passover. That kind of sets the Old Testament context for us, because what happens in John chapter 6 after this mention of an impending Passover is Jesus crosses the sea and there's a miraculous feeding of the crowds. And then he has this long discourse about himself being the bread of life. So, of course, this is pulling from the Exodus account, in which there's the Passover in Exodus chapter 12, and then the crossing of the sea, as well as the miraculous feeding of the people of Israel with manna in the wilderness. Now, that's John chapter 6. When we get to John chapter 21, we have something similar happening, except in a little bit broader structure. So what has just happened? Well, the Passover of Passover has happened. Jesus has accomplished that eschatological Passover in which he has won salvation, not just for Israel, but for the entire world. He's accomplished this for us. And then he is going to now appear to his disciples at a sea, just like in the book of Exodus. There's the Passover, and then the next main event happens at the Red Sea. Well, now we're at the Sea of Tiberias. Well, what's going to happen here? Well, basically this. What Jesus is going to demonstrate is that he holds the power as the one who's conquered death, who's conquered evil. He holds the power over the sea, just like God did in days of old. Now, he's not going to walk over the sea, but he's going to demonstrate that by his word, by his power as the Word made flesh, as Yahweh made flesh, he is the one who exercises dominion over the fish of the sea. Now, he does this for a couple of different reasons. If you look back in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 26 and 28, God gives Adam and Eve dominion over creation. And the very first thing in the list that he gives them dominion over is the fish of the sea. So in this particular case, here we have Jesus as the new Adam, as the creator-made creature, the image maker made into his own image, who has brought about a new creation, now standing on the shore of a sea, and by means of his word, which brought all creation into being, which made Adam and gave him dominion over the fish of the sea. Now he stands there, exercising dominion over these fish as the one who's brought about a new creation. And so this dominion over the fish of the sea and putting 153 of them into this net is his way of declaring that he is indeed the one who has that power to bring about a new creation for all of those who are part of his kingdom. So that's the first thing that's going on here. There's a new creation theme that is exhibited there on the seashore of the Lake of Tiberias. But there's also something else going on, something which is very fascinating. So if you look in the Old Testament prophets, in Isaiah, for instance, in Isaiah chapter 51, verses 9 and following, you have this really unusual image in which the prophets are drawing upon ancient mythologies that were popular, for instance, in Babylon, about these chaos monsters who are conquered by means of the stronger God. Well, they've drawn upon these ancient mythologies. Isaiah has, the Old Testament prophets have. They've drawn upon these ancient mythologies to describe the work of God. And so you have language about God exercising dominion at the Red Sea and cutting in pieces Rahab and various sea monsters. So the image of Leviathan and Rahab and sea monsters being conquered by Yahweh at creation as well as at the Red Sea is the Old Testament prophet's way of drawing upon these various cultural stories in order to preach about God's victory over the enemies at the Red Sea, and also his victory, his taming of chaos by means of his word, bringing order out of chaos. So you have that going on, but you also have something very fascinating in one of the Psalms. In Psalm 74, there's also a reference to the crossing of the sea and God exercising his strength or his power there. But there's another element that's added. It says that he has crushed the heads of the sea monsters, and he's split Rahab into pieces, and he's split Leviathan into pieces, the sea monster, and he's gave him his food to the people of the wilderness. So this is very unusual. In fact, I think it's the only time in the Old Testament this occurs. You have other instances where God conquers Leviathan or Rahab, these sea monsters, but here he cuts them in pieces and he feeds them to the people of the wilderness. So this is the prophet's way, or the psalmist way, of describing in very graphic sorts of images that Yahweh is the one who brings his people safely through the sea. He destroys the powers that oppose them. He is the one who holds full dominion over everything in creation, and he is the one who conquers chaos, so much so that he is able to cut it in two and then feed it to his people in the wilderness. Now you put all of this together as a background to John chapter 21. So Jesus now, he is the Lord, he is Yahweh, he's the Word made flesh, he's the new creation who's brought about a new Passover. He's the one who has dominion over the sea, and in this case it's the Sea of Tiberias. By means of his word, he speaks and he shows that he has the authority to bring about this great catch of fish. And not only that, but then he feeds his disciples. He feeds this new nucleus of a new Israel by means of the sea. Just like the psalmist drew upon this imagery of God conquering the powers of the sea and feeding them to the people in the wilderness. So I think all of this is providing a rich and a very graphic background for what's happening in John chapter 21, because Jesus now stands there as the one who's conquered all evil, all the powers of darkness, all the chaos of the world. He stands there on that seashore, just like Israel was there with Yahweh on the seashore of the Red Sea. And just like at the break of day, the Israelites saw the Egyptians conquered, now this takes place at the break of day. And just like Yahweh fed his people in the wilderness as a demonstration of his grace and of his power, So Jesus is now feeding his disciples from the sea as a demonstration that he is the one who is all powerful, who has conquered death, and is now providing for his people. So all of this, as I say, in John chapter 21, is enriched by our understanding of an Old Testament background in which John is playing with various images in the Old Testament, especially drawn from Exodus, but also from Isaiah 51, as well as from Psalm 74, to provide us with an understanding, a deeper understanding of exactly why he manifests himself in this way to his disciples on the shore of the sea. And I hope this has provided you with a little deeper understanding of what's happening in this third manifestation of our Lord to his disciples after his resurrection. And as always, thanks for watching, and may God continue to bless your Easter season.